Welcome back to the final episode of our three-part Inside the Room, the Brexit Plots, and we're in at the end game.
Yeah, so the country's just voted to leave. It's obviously a huge shock, and it's going to have big implications for British politics and Britain's relationship with the rest of the world. But what we're going to explore is those first few hours, and the immediate impact is on the financial markets because the pound is falling, the stock market, not just in Britain but around the world, is starting to fall. What happens next?
And then we're going to talk about the days after, Labour chaos, Tory leadership chaos, and then we're going to stand back and reflect upon how draining this has been and what it all means.
And of course, we've got in the room with us still Michael Gove, chairman of Leave. At this point, he's effectively become one of the leaders of the country, hasn't he? Because the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has been defeated. The Chancellor, myself, I've been defeated. And everyone's waiting to hear what Michael and Boris have got to say.
First of all, though, a recap on what's happening around us.
The dawn is breaking on an independent, united kingdom.
The historic decision by British voters for their country to exit the European Union sent economic shockwaves from the UK to the US.
Some market and economic volatility can be expected as this process unfolds.
It was an earthquake, Britain turning its back on Europe, a shaken Prime Minister resigning.
And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
Here is the man, one of David Cameron's oldest political rivals, who will be seen to have toppled him as leader of the Leave campaign and who may succeed him.
They have decided that it is time to vote to take back control.
The British people have made their decision. We must respect that result, and Article 50 has to be invoked now so that we negotiate an exit from the European Union.
We need strong and effective leadership of the Labour Party. I told Jeremy Corbyn last night that I no longer had confidence in his leadership, and he dismissed me from the shadow cabinet. And I want to thank him for having given me the chance to serve our party.
Let's start with the financial markets, because that's the first thing that reacts. There's a big fall in the pound, and that's Mark Carney, one of those voices coming out as governor of the Bank of England. And I should say, one of the kind of criticisms levelled at myself and David Cameron and the government at the time is that we didn't prepare for leave. We didn't, the Cameron government did no preparations. And in the years afterwards, this was often thrown at us. And I would say, strongly defend that we couldn't possibly have anticipated what kind of Brexit we wanted. We were arguing against Brexit, and it wasn't for us to make that decision. It was for the Parliament, or parliaments as it turned out subsequently. But we did do a lot of preparations for the financial contingencies of what might go wrong for a Leave vote. And I worked closely with Mark Carney, and that work never really surfaced, never really became public. There was a shock to the markets, but we didn't get the kind of collapse of banks or the precipitous fall of the pound, although we got pretty close to it, that would have required government intervention. So there was a lot of contingency planning around that. But apart from that, there were no plans for what happened next. And so British politics suddenly opens up into this kind of wide vista where you've got a Prime Minister resigning, that's David Cameron's resignation speech on the steps of Downing Street. And you've also got, I think, something that people don't really remember now, a crisis in the Labour Party happening at the same time. So that's the morning after. So, Michael, let's just start with, you've woken up, you've absorbed the fact that Leave has won. It's obviously an incredible victory for you personally. Had you anticipated that David Cameron was going to resign that next morning?
I feared that would be the case. I hoped that he would stay on. But I knew this is one of the reasons why the original decision was so personally difficult. I mean, I'm not asking for sympathy, but it just was. Because I knew that this was a possible outcome. And I was in the Leave HQ when David rang, switch put through the call, and he requested to speak to me, and he explained that he was about to make a statement and stand down as Prime Minister. I was profoundly saddened by the fact that his career had ended in that way, but my feelings were of course mixed because I was there with people who had contributed to one of the biggest changes in politics, in years, and something of which I had been at the heart. At the time, the policy question that preoccupied me was a hope that the Article 50 process would not be triggered, because that would send us straight into a race against the clock, and we would not have been in a position to manage the negotiated outcome that I'd hoped to see.
So a couple of points. So first of all, you said, you hoped that he wouldn't stand down, but you knew, as he knew and as I knew, he couldn't remain. It's fanciful. He's criticised, isn't he, for kind of abandoning the ship in the storm, and David Cameron shouldn't have. He got a lot of stick afterwards, which I think surprised him and me, frankly. We thought it was the honourable thing to do rather than draw out his demise. He could not have remained. I mean, he'd made an argument that this was a very bad move for the country. And how was he ever going to be the person who, even in the months ahead, steered the country?
The counter-argument, Jeremy Corbyn, a weak leader, of course, triggering Article 50 straight away,
yes.
A disastrous thing for him today to do, precipitated the Hillary Benn reaction. At that moment, the country is hugely divided, massively uncertain. If David Cameron had asked me, I would have urged him not to resign, to get us through the coming days and weeks, rather than plunging us into the uncertainty of there not being a prime minister when we don't know what we're going to do. And it ends up with the leadership needing to come from the press conference that you and Boris Johnson hold, which feels as though it's pretty unclear what the hell you think you're up to. And wasn't it, Ruth Davidson said, it was like two young arsonists who suddenly find out that they've burned down the school and they don't know what to do.
Yeah. Three things. I feared, obviously, that David was going to resign. I was not at all surprised by it, though regretful. I do believe that it would have been possible for him to stay on. I don't criticise him for going, but I think Ed is right, and there are precedents, and I argued this, for other prime ministers in other jurisdictions having lost referenda, staying on as the head of government. The press conference is certainly one of the thoughts in my mind was the fact that David Cameron's political career has ended. I have been as responsible as anyone for that, and that was in my mind. It's also the case, however, that when people say that there was no plan, there was and in some detail, an outline, vote leaves outline, of what should happen. Now, the fact that plan was not effectively put in place until much later was a result of other events, which I suspect we're probably going to touch on now.
But don't you think, Michael, I mean, Ed's got a point, that press conference, looking back on it, when you appear with Boris Johnson, it reminds me of a press conference that happened in America later that year, when Donald Trump wins the presidential election and he comes onto the stage that night. And you can see he's as shocked as anyone that he's become president. Yeah. And the two of you, you and Boris, you look absolutely shocked. And the financial markets, are in some turmoil. The prime minister's resigned. The kind of country is looking at this moment to you two as being the people in charge.
The opposition is in total chaos.
The opposition is I'm not saying that this did any kind of lasting damage.
I think he's saying that you shouldn't have slept for 8 hours the night before and you should have been writing your speech for the press conference.
Possibly. But I think that people were attributing to us all sorts of feelings and projecting onto us all sorts of feelings at that time. And again, I've long got used to people attempting to guess what's really going in my, or indeed other else's heads at that time. The truth is that there was a personal and emotional thing, because I recognised that a friendship which had gone through a difficult period would now end. And so that was a personal thing. But there was also a political sense that we needed to make sure that the vote leave prospectus was enacted. And one of the things that we both felt was it would be wrong in the immediate aftermath of David's fall to look exultant and gleeful and that we both felt that Nigel Farage's tone had been inappropriate. But of course, in our desire not to seem exultant and gleeful, not to punch the air Neil Kinnock Sheffield Rally style, people inevitably thought, well, these two look like naughty schoolboys.
And standing next to Boris Johnson, even in that moment,
yes,
before things unfold, do you stand there and think, he's the leader?
Yes. I think in the run-up to the vote, there were a couple of people who said, if we win, Michael, David Cameron won't be the Prime Minister, you should go for it. This was in the run-up beforehand. And I said, no, I'm not entertaining any sort of talk like that, for a host of reasons. Yeah. I want David Cameron to stay as Prime Minister. We are in a stronger position. The country is. Leave is, if David Cameron stays as Prime Minister. Then in the aftermath of the vote, a number of people contacted me to say, you should stand and Boris shouldn't. And I felt, no, he is the bigger figure.
And straight after the press conference, you tell him you're minded to support him.
Correct.
But I think, isn't it the case that obviously, and this is the way politics works, suddenly the crown is on the ground. It's
yes.
like, the king is dead, the crown is on the ground. And
but Michael's told him that he can have it. He said to Boris, I'm going to back you.
No, I know, but British politics immediately moves on to a leadership contest about who's going to be the Prime Minister. So we go from this momentous decision to leave the EU after 50 years and all these questions it's going to throw up about our trading relationships and security arrangements. But, first things first, who's going to be the Prime Minister?
Yeah,
and
if you think of that Sunday, on the Sunday you've got...
this is Sunday after the Thursday vote. Yeah.
On the Sunday after the vote, you've got Hilary Benn resigning / being sacked by Jeremy Corbyn at 3 a.m. A whole series of shadow cabinet members are resigning all day Sunday as they collect votes for a vote of no confidence. Meanwhile, you have pledged support for Boris and you go out to meet him at a cricket match.
Not quite. Boris, I think on the Saturday, though I'll have to check this, had been playing in a cricket match against Earl Spencer's 11 at Althorp. On the Sunday, I go to Boris's house in Oxfordshire.
So he's recovering from the cricket match?
Yes. And I am driven there by my former political advisor, Henry Cook, in his Mini. And it is me, Henry Cook, Henry Newman, still my special advisor, and a person called Beth Armstrong, very talented individual, now working in Number 10.
To plan the way ahead?
Yes.
To plan the Boris leadership campaign, because you phone me up.
Yes.
And you say, George, you've got to get behind Boris. And
isn't there a thought that you're going to be Foreign Secretary?
Well, so we have a conversation. The first thing I say, well, come on, Michael. I mean, you've won the referendum. Congratulations. Boris Johnson, are we sure about this? And you said to me, look, he's changed. I've worked with him in this campaign. I've seen him really close up. I think he's got real qualities that you would admire, George. And look, he definitely would want you in the top team. And, there are jobs like Foreign Secretary that are going to be going. So that I remember that conversation.
Who leaks that to the papers, you or Michael?
I don't think it ever was leaked.
Was it leaked? Well,
I see. I thought it was.
I don't think it was ever leaked. Not at the time.
No. We don't. Our conversations never leak.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Unlike the conversations with the Queen.
I do.
I don't know who would have done that.
I do apologise. I know it. I don't know why I know it. I assumed it must be because I'd read it.
I think in subsequent books there's speculation about it.
I see. And the Sunday, what is it like meeting Boris? I mean, is it a good meeting?
It's convivial.
Convivial? Oh my gosh, that sounds like code.
No.
Was he absolutely pissed?
No, of course not. No. What I mean is that it was friendly, but also it was...
was alcohol taken?
No. Not by me and not by Boris. I think there were one or two of the other folk there may have had...
So it was a sober Sunday lunch?
Yes. But it was a meeting of two different...
Do you believe this, George?
Yeah. Two different of tribes, philosophies, and all the rest of it. In that, Team Boris, core Team Boris, were
Hungover.
No, relaxing in the sun, were jolly. It was everything is going to be okay.
Team Gove
was, look, we've got to get a spreadsheet up and running. We've got to get numbers. We've got to do this. You've got to prepare for this. There's going to be this exercise. There's going to be this argument.
Wasn't there a barbecue?
There was, yes.
Wasn't there too much? So you're telling me Boris Johnson has a barbecue on the Sunday lunchtime?
Yes.
And does not have a single drop of alcohol?
He did not have anything to drink.
I think the question should be he didn't have a clue rather than he didn't have anything to drink.
Well, it's a contrast in styles. And again, it was that afternoon that a worm of doubt entered my mind about how seriously Boris was taking the exercise.
But not because he was hungover?
No.
And not because he was drinking at lunchtime?
No.
So what was this worm of doubt?
The general sense that, Boris wasn't saying to his team, come on, guys, let's engage with Michael and these guys. And also, he said to me, he drew me aside at one point, and he said to me, Michael, I know I said that you should be running my campaign. Yeah? Actually, I said the same thing to Ben Wallace. He's a gay guy. I said, Ben is a great guy, yes. He said, well, I said the same thing to Ben, so can you do it together? And I said, look, there can only be one person running a campaign. Ben is a great guy, but either it's Ben or it's me.
And he's offered you the chancellorship, but he's also offered it to Andrea Leadsom.
Well, that was another story and a half, in that one of the things that we said to Boris was, under no circumstance discuss jobs or offer jobs during the course of this exercise. Then Andrea said...
Although you have, by this point, been given 2 jobs.
Well, potentially. But then Andrea comes in, and she'd had a very good campaign. And Andrea says, I either want to be the lead negotiator or chancellor.
And you're both by this point.
And Boris says... And literally 90 seconds beforehand, Boris had said, look, well, of course, we won't discuss jobs. He said, look, I can't make you chancellor. The Gover's going to be chancellor. And then subsequently, we formed, we had a conversation with Andrea, wanted her on board and all the rest of it. And then there was a critical moment. There was a need for Boris to seal the deal, to hand over a letter to Andrea to reassure her. Whether or not actually that letter being handed over would have reassured her is a different story. However... there was a simple thing he needed to do, and that was to give a piece of paper to another MP. And by so doing, he would make it overwhelmingly likely that she would not stand and that he would be Prime Minister. And the fact that he couldn't even do that made me feel, and again, people have speculated over this particular episode many times, made me feel that he wasn't ready to be Prime Minister.
You're teeing up the end of our story here.
Let's remind ourselves of these days of high political drama.
The referendum saw much fear, but in the days since, we've seen spasms of hate. This incident, just one of the hate crimes since polling day.
Take back control. Their slogan helped win Britain's EU referendum for Vote Leave. But with Europe waiting to hear just what the UK actually wants from Brexit, the United Front collapsed as Gove, not Johnson, said he'd run for Prime Minister. Was this betrayal, Boris's brother was asked.
Ask Michael.
Boris is an amazing and an impressive person. But I've realised in the last few days that Boris isn't capable of building that team and providing that unity. And so I came reluctantly but firmly to the conclusion that as someone who had argued from the beginning that we should leave the European Union, that I had to stand for the leadership of the Conservative Party.
But I must tell you that having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
The country's next Prime Minister will be a woman. The Home Secretary Theresa May and Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom have both been voted into the final round of the Conservative leadership contest. The Justice Secretary Michael Gove was eliminated from the race. We'll have all the reaction from Westminster.
First of all, those clips take us back to that time, and they remind us that there's some real issues going on in the country. There's although it's temporary, there's a kind of surge in hostility towards European citizens living in the country. Temperatures are running high. There's a lot of questions out there, not least from other European countries, about what Britain's going to do next. But in amongst all of this, there's the drama of who's going to be the next Prime Minister. And Michael, you make this decision. You're Boris Johnson's campaign manager, and then you decide to run for Prime Minister and tell everyone that Boris shouldn't be the Prime Minister. When you look back on those days, do you think you basically made a big mistake? You should not have backed Boris in the first place, or having backed Boris, you should have stuck with it. But what you did ultimately was very damaging to you yourself.
Yes. I think this is the political question that I've been asked more often that isn't to do with policy. And I wanted to believe, and did believe, that Boris had grown during the referendum campaign and was ready. And then I, for reasons we touched on briefly, lost confidence in the judgment that he had changed sufficiently and was sufficiently ready. And I thought, I can't, in all honesty, recommend him to the British people and say, he's now ready to be Prime Minister. But you're right, that in a way, I should either have not backed him at all in the beginning, or having made my bed, followed through and backed him a little. And finally, if it was the case that I was going to withdraw, I shouldn't have run myself. I should have said, look, I'm terribly sorry. I no longer think he's right.
I asked you a moment ago, though, about the Friday. You said when you stood with him at the press conference on the Friday, the day after the referendum, he was the leader.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a hell of a change of mind in, what was it, 72 hours or something?
Just over. But yeah, the key thing is that it was during that period that when, exactly for the reasons that George mentions, we had to choose someone to be Prime Minister to take us through what was at that time a turbulent period. Obviously, things subsequently calmed down quite quickly. But nevertheless, it was really important to decide who was going to steer the country through that. And it was an accumulation of decisions and choices that Boris made that made me think, I'm going to have to revisit this decision.
Often it's an intervention from, a spouse or a close friend or an ally. Was there a particular intervention which made you think
that
I've
night,
got to do this?
That night, i.e. the night before I withdrew my support, I had a conversation with my wife and some friends about it all, and we came to the conclusion, which was manifest, and I did what I did.
Did some big press barons, were they encouraging you to stand, saying you'd have the support of key newspapers?
No, my wife Sarah thought that would be the case.
Tim Shipman writes that you did have an intervention from a senior press baron who'd spoken to, I think, George earlier in the day and set up a call.
An Australian one.
Oh, sorry. No. I'm not being
quite a famous one.
I know. I'm not being
obtuse. You're not.
No, it's just that there was so much that was a whirl at that time.
I think if Rupert Murdoch rang me and said, "Ed, it's your moment. You've got to stand for leader," I'd remember.
There were again.
Did that never happen to you?
No. But if you had,
it may yet.
I'm just saying that I don't think I'd forget it.
You don't get invited to the best pajama parties.
I think that it wasn't quite as simple or as clear cut as that.
What, in the call?
When
you spoke to him, he wasn't as simple and clear cut as that.
Well, again, I'm going to respect the privacy of that
he's
conversation.
He's not the Queen.
I know,
Michael,
but
he's not.
I'll respect the privacy of the conversation.
He's very much still alive and very influential today.
I will respect.
Anyway, we will move on from Rupert Murdoch.
Boris's people, though, believe that, aside from Rupert Murdoch and George Osborne and all this stuff, that what actually happened was an elaborate plan over the course of that evening. You referred to the text which should have been sent to Andrea Leadsom, the letter which should have been sent, and that actually you and Nick knew what you were doing, and poor old Boris was outmaneuvered, and you used then the excuse of the treatment of Andrea Leadsom as the reason why Boris had to be pushed aside, but you knew exactly what you were doing?
Absolutely not. I don't think there's any way anyone looking at the events... I mean, there are many criticisms that can be levelled at me and others, but I don't think anyone looking at the way in which events played out can think that this was a contrived or pre-cooked plot. I mean, it's just impossible. You only need to look at the nature of it. And the
How
key
did
things...
Nick Bowles end up being Boris Johnson's speechwriter at 1 a.m, the night before his launch? I mean, it's slightly odd. He was a Remainer.
I also had missed calls from you at about 2 a.m. I woke up. This was the day before Boris Johnson was supposed to announce his bid for the premiership. And I just remember waking up the next morning having a couple of missed calls from you at 2 a.m, thinking, "Oh my God, what's happening?" And then I turned on the radio and I was like, "Okay, we should draw all this to an end." And we've said that this podcast is, we're not examining what happened in terms of the negotiations around Brexit. We will no doubt come to that on another Inside the Room, and the troubles that Theresa May had and then subsequently Boris Johnson had as Prime Minister. I guess I've got one question, though, from this period. Do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better if Boris Johnson had become the Prime Minister at that point? So essentially the leader of Brexit had taken charge of Brexit right from the off?
Yes, I think probably with the benefit of hindsight, yes.
Why?
Because we would have implemented or sought to implement the plan that Vote Leave had developed, the prospectus that was agreed amongst the people at the heart of the referendum campaign. And there was always a difficulty. I'm a fan of Theresa May's, but there was always a difficulty in having someone, even as reluctant to remain as she, as a Remain Prime Minister, delivering Brexit. So politics is full of what-ifs, but I think on balance, that would have been the right thing. The other thing also is the point's been made that when Boris is up against it, he finds inner reserves. And notwithstanding everything, I think that when he did eventually become Prime Minister, at moments of crisis, both delivering Brexit and during the pandemic, he did find those inner reserves. And again, I know that George has a range of views about Boris, but I think that, he has phenomenal strengths as well as areas of weakness.
We won't have a whole... We won't discuss Boris too much here. I mean, I think he had great strengths as London Mayor, and if he'd stuck to the kind of mayor he was and the kind of political beliefs he had then, rather than doing a Faustian pact with Brexit, he would have had actually a more successful political career. He would have been a more successful Prime Minister. But anyway, that's for another episode. I just want to, let's just end this with, I look back on this period as basically the worst couple of months of my political career. It ended really my time in politics. I went from being someone who was one of the favourites, being the Prime Minister, to out on my ear a few days after the events we're talking about, and something happened to my country which I still to this day think was a profound mistake for Britain and its future. So I look back on this really with horror, and reliving all this is just sort of, as we said right at the beginning of this podcast, triggering all sorts of terrible memories of how we got into this mess and how I conducted myself during this mess and the mistakes that I made. But presumably for you, Michael, and you're one of my good friends, you look back on this as, despite your long career, and you've been in the cabinet longer than anyone else, you look back on this period and you go, these were the greatest couple of months of my political career.
I don't think that, but I do.
Why not? I mean, surely this was, when they write the stories of Michael Gove in the years to come, this is when you make the biggest impact on British history.
Yes, but I think it was the Duke of Wellington who said, "There's nothing half so melancholy as a battle lost as a battle won." And I am glad that we left the European Union. I will defend, if you or anyone else wants me to have one, Brexit for a host of reasons. I won't rehearse those arguments now. It was the case that there were people with whom I worked on that campaign who are dear friends, and that campaign provided an even closer bond. But as I said earlier, referenda are bruising events, and nobody can contemplate them, even if they're happy with the result. Nobody can contemplate the process with equanimity.
But we do know in politics that there are certain moments
Yes.
when the top line of your obituary is written. And this was when, I think, regardless of what's happened subsequently in your political career, that first line was written. Michael Gove, the man who took Britain out of the European Union. And when people look back in decades and centuries to come, how will they judge that?
Well, I think they will judge that that was the right decision. I think, actually, one of the things for which I will be remembered is saying people in this country have had enough of experts. As we heard earlier in the programme, I did put out an important qualification on that. But in the same way as Jim Callaghan never really said crisis, what crisis, but that's the phrase that's associated with him, I suspect that is one of the things that will be associated with me. There are multiple ironies, but again...
So you think it will be well judged?
One of the reasons why I got rid of coursework as Education Secretary is I don't believe that you should mark your own efforts. So, others will judge. I will defend Brexit passionately, but it is also the case that my political career, like most political careers, is marred by mistakes and misjudgments. And I hope in this programme I've acknowledged some of those mistakes. But the central argument, I absolutely believe is the right one.
Michael Gove, thank you for being inside the room with us.
Yes, that was great. I don't agree with you, but it was great.
No, that was the thing. That's why it's great.
These poor guys, they're looking so triggered. It's such a nightmare. That was completely draining, I found. 2 hours talking with Michael Gove. And I don't know what you felt. I guess the thing which worries me for our listeners is we're talking about what was happening inside the room, the conversations, the lunches, Boris Johnson's personal ambitions. This was actually about the future of the country and jobs and our long-term investment prospects. And, it was a massive and, I think pretty risky decision.
Yeah, I think the couple of things I'd say about that. I mean, I thought the whole thing was fascinating, even though for me it was reliving a very painful period of my life. I mean, the first is the nature of politics in any country at any time in history is this interaction between these huge issues, war and peace, big movements in the economy, big movements in currencies and how it affects immigration and all those sort of huge issues we talk about. But politics is also conducted by people. And, whether you were looking in at, a Roman emperor's court or, what was going on in Tudor England or the House of Commons in the 19th century, it's all about characters and individuals as well and how they interact with those big issues. And so what we heard from Michael, was an insight into the motivations and the enmities and the likes and the dislikes and of the people running the Leave campaign. And hopefully you heard from us some of the issues that were going on in the Remain campaign. I think the second point, however, is there is a fair criticism of the referendum. And I think lots of people share a responsibility for this, myself absolutely included, which is I wonder whether before polling day, Britain was really aware of the magnitude of the decision it was making. This was a once-in-an-epoch decision that would affect Britain's prosperity and its foreign relations and its relationship with itself for many decades to come. And you think of all the political chaos that followed, the many prime ministers, the, trauma the country felt, that was not aired on the day. And I think collectively the two campaigns and the media covering it, including the independent broadcasters, did not bring that to everyone's sufficiently to everyone's attention. Doesn't mean the result would have been different.
I think though that for Leave voters and maybe for older Leave voters, they did feel this is our one chance, and I'm not sure whether Remain voters or younger voters who didn't turn out in the numbers which people expected to quite understood that in that way. I guess the other thing though is if you think of Boris Johnson's style, bluff, funny, making light of everything, and the fact that you all knew each other, I mean, there is a sense of a bunch of mates messing about with the future of the country.
Yeah, of course. I'm very conscious of that. And it's true that we all knew each other, but that's, I guess, true of other great moments in British history, both good moments and bad moments, when, decisions are made that can be catastrophic. And, and if you look at the history of the First World War and how it's conducted, there's a kind of big rivalry there between Asquith and Lloyd George, and Lloyd George is a bit of a kind of Boris Johnson character. And, so I don't think these things are unique to this time. I think it reminded us also that there were other players on the pitch. There were obviously these leading Conservatives, including myself. There was the Labour Party and all that was going on inside the Labour Party.
A disaster.
And it begs to, if you ask the question, could the result have been different? I thought one of the most interesting things Michael Gove said, and I don't actually necessarily agree with him, he said that Remain fought the best campaign they could possibly have fought, given where they started. And that's quite interesting because there's quite a heavy criticism of Remain, that we ran the economic argument too hard, that we were too, that Project Fear, as the Leave campaign called it, was, too alarmist, that we didn't make an emotional argument for the EU. Michael says, well, that was all hopeless because there wasn't an emotional argument to be made for the EU at that point.
I guess I felt in the conversation that you downplayed the importance of the renegotiation. And I accept that, given where you started after David Cameron came back, maybe that was the campaign which had to be fought. But you have to stand back and say, was this a strategy from him which fundamentally was flawed? This was the guy who had left the centre-right grouping in the European Parliament in 2005 to appease sceptics to become leader of the Conservative Party. This was the guy who in 2011 had gone to the Six-Pack Summit and walked out and didn't agree with all the other leaders what they wanted, an across Europe deal to protect the euro. And then he then went back after 2015 and said, cut me a deal. And they didn't deliver. And the problem was, having raised expectations so much that he was going to deliver change and reform, including around migration, the emergency brake, when in the end he came back and didn't deliver that, it ended up with the Remain campaign being a status quo campaign. It wasn't about change. It was saying, stick with us, because to leave would be worse. And the problem was, especially I think for lots of Labour voters, people thought, well, if this is the best it gets, I'll roll the dice for change. And I think that is in the end the problem. It was a status quo campaign at a time when the country, or lots of parts of the country, wanted change.
Yeah, but it was fundamentally misleading to say to people that leaving the EU was going to give them back control or increase their prosperity or make them feel more connected with the global economy than they had felt. So,
but David Cameron had promised that. He'd promised that renegotiation. Well, he said he could do that.
No, I think the renegotiation was flawed because you could never get out of the EU the wholesale change in the relationship with the EU that people expected him to deliver. The EU is a rule-based organisation with, at the time, 28 different countries, all of whom have got their own issues. And it's a kind of British exceptionalism to believe that somehow we should get some, unique treatment. And remember, we already were out of the euro and we already had a rebate on the budget. We weren't in the Schengen borders. We already had a pretty...
There'd been decades of British exceptionalism.
Right, so
the fact that you thought of going to Merkel in the final 10 days obviously means you knew there was a problem and you thought possibly playing the British exceptionalism card again might have worked.
Well, I think it was more a case of saying to Merkel that it would be very bad for the EU itself if Britain left, which I also believe to be the case because the EU has lost one of its most important players. I think there's a sort of question also of, is the referendum inevitable? There's sometimes a good question in politics. Are things inevitable? Are forces at work?
Well, you and Michael Gove both said no.
Right. So David would say that the referendum was inevitable. And I think he would point to a whole set of things that had happened in the decades before. A refusal of the major government to give a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s, even though one was held for at the time, for example, in Denmark. There's then Tony Blair's promise going into the 97 election that if they ever were to join the euro, there'd be a referendum. And so that enters the kind of bloodstream as another thing. There's Tony Blair and Jack Straw promising a referendum on the Convention of Europe, which became the Lisbon Treaty, and then rescinding that promise. There's a succession of Tory leaders who fight and lose elections during that period, promising referendums on various things. And there's something called the Referendum Party. So, this idea, and you said it in the conversation with Michael, that who could object to asking the people? It became a very kind of convenient resting place for a lot of politicians with a lot of different views on Europe to say we might not be able to agree on our European view, but let's agree to ask the people.
So this is my personal view. I think you can absolutely blame Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and John Major for not making the argument strongly enough. I can be grumpy at you. Why didn't you resist David Cameron on the referendum before 2015? I can think Michael Gove shouldn't have done it. Boris Johnson shouldn't have done it. I can talk about details of the campaign. In the end, the Prime Minister was David Cameron. He went through the lobbies with us in 2011 voting against a referendum and then changed his mind. It was him who had walked out of the summit in 2011. I woke up twice in 2014 and 2016 to hear the Today programme. In 2014, after you'd just won the Scottish referendum, it was David Cameron saying, I'm now going to play the English votes for English laws card. I mean, the most party short-termist thing to do. In 2016, I woke up, he'd just lost the referendum he had called, and he's resigning. And I'm thinking, in both times, what I want somebody to do is bind the country and unite us and lead. And both times, he did the opposite of the leadership thing. So in the end, I feel, if I'm apportioning blame, I'm sorry, David Cameron takes for me the lion's share.
Yeah, look, I think he himself, takes a lot of the burden on his own shoulders of calling that referendum and then losing it. I think he'd still take the view that it was inevitable and it was better to kind of confront the decision rather than put it off. And he, interestingly, after he resigns, he gets a handwritten letter from John Major saying, it was private, but he later made it public, saying that referendum was inevitable and it was going to come. Now, I would say, but didn't have to be on our watch. He didn't, Michael Gove would also say, I think, it doesn't have to be on our watch. Okay, someone else can have that referendum.
I'd have had it once I'd succeeded in my renegotiation and had a deal to actually give to people change.
But you would never have been able to deliver a deal that I think would have satisfied people who had concerns about the EU or had concerns about immigration or had concerns that they were ignored voices in our country.
So leaving was inevitable.
Well, I think it does beg this question, which is, for the future, does the EU have to address immigration, or will it face further kind of Brexit moments? Other countries, I notice, an increasing number of their populist right-wing and left-wing parties are promising, Frexit, French exit, Gexit, German exit, Dutch exit. These are core members of the EU. They founded it in a way we didn't. And if you don't address this immigration problem, which I have been, not alert to enough over my political career, are we actually going to find other countries starting to leave the EU? So, there is it's not inevitable, I think, that we had to have a referendum, but is it inevitable that immigration was going to collide with EU membership at some point? Yes, potentially.
I think the answer to that is yes. And the choice isn't control the borders and the choice isn't shut the borders or have open migration. I wrote an article in 2010 in the Labour leadership election in The Observer saying we would not sustain our membership of the European Union as it enlarged without controls on economic migration. It was very unpopular at the time. I've always been of the view that free movement might have worked for the small core. It wasn't going to work as people became mobile.
You can't at the moment persuade the EU and its leading states that is the case. And they defend, in fact, they regard immigration as more an external border problem than an internal problem. I think there's another interesting question.
I understand that, although, as you said, that is changing. And the question is, in the end, can you have a Europe which has on this scale, open borders internally. And my view is not unless you go down a political road which Britain was never going to go down. So actually persuading them to at least allow us to have an exception or to have flexibility, the emergency brake, that was the only way to make it work. David Cameron was right, but then he didn't deliver.
Because ultimately it was undeliverable, I think, in the context of the EU at the time. I think there's another question which we should come back to, I think, on a separate podcast, which is, if we'd joined the euro, would we have left the EU? Because the question in the referendum would have been very similar to the one that the Scottish people faced in 2014. If we leave the EU, your euro-denominated mortgage, you're still going to have a mortgage in euros, but you're going to be paid in pounds, and the pounds are going to be worth less probably immediately after departure. What's the currency you're going to have in your pocket? And when Greece considered leaving the euro in the heat of this period, fundamentally they backed off, the Greek people, because they were scared of the impact on the currency and their own personal finances. And that would have given the Remain campaign the actually sort of killer question. Of course, all sorts of other questions about whether we should have been in the euro or not. But
I think, though, I think we should definitely come back to that, because undoubtedly it would have made the campaign better in 2016. In my view, if we'd joined the euro, we would have left in September, October 2007, at the height of the financial crisis, when we had to do things to bail out the banks. The European Union could not have coped with that. We'd have left the euro and the European Union and probably destroyed the euro. There would have been no euro to talk about by the time we got to 2014 or 16. Different conversation. Can I ask you one other thing? Because we were here with Michael Gove, so generous of him with his time. Fundamentally, do you think he was the pivotal individual? Was his decision to campaign for leave in February 2016, was that the most important thing, or was Boris Johnson or other individuals or factors more important?
Well, I think you can make a very good argument that Michael Gove's decision to support leave is the crucial moment, because what it does is it gives credibility to leave, which until then had looked very fringe and right-wing, and people like Nigel Farage were the leading figures in it. So it gave it kind of mainstream credibility. It gave it some intellectual credibility as well, which it had been lacking. And then crucially, what Michael Gove does, he's not at the time a particularly popular sort of figure out in the country. In fact, David Cameron moved him out of being Education Secretary because he wasn't very popular. But what he does is he creates the space that Boris Johnson feels he has to move into, because Boris is thinking about the crown. He's thinking about the premiership. And he's thinking, if Michael Gove has moved, I've got to move. And I could see in the conversations with Boris, it all changed the moment Gove declared.
And I could see in our conversations, you were bristling a bit. I mean, fundamentally, although he's a friend of yours, you haven't really forgiven him.
Well, I don't think that's true, actually. I have a lot of respect.
You have forgiven him.
I still think it was a terrible decision for the country, and I think he made a miscalculation of what it would mean for Britain, and I don't think he anticipated the fallout, really. I mean, he said he was quite tentative at the end when he said he still thinks it's the right thing that we left the EU.
He probably thought me asking about his obituary was a bit premature.
But I always thought with Michael, he said in advance to me, look, I've always wanted to leave the EU. This referendum is going to be very difficult for me. He said that at the time. He didn't want a referendum. And I don't think he ever, was doing things entirely for reasons of sort of venality or personal ambition. This is what he believed. Did he create, therefore, space for people who perhaps were a bit more venal? Yes. And I would say the decisive figure in the referendum is Boris Johnson, because he's the most popular politician in Britain. You can just hear in all the clips we played, he's just, he had at that time, obviously a lot of water has passed on the bridge since, an incredible charisma and an ability to reach.
But if Michael hadn't gone,
Boris wouldn't have gone, I don't think.
That is all we've got time for on this edition of Inside the Room.